April 1941, Tobruk, Libya. Erwin Rommel, the general who had never lost a battle, surrounded a fortress with 35,000 troops and expected it to fall in 2 days. Inside were just 14,000 Australian soldiers who were about to do something no army had ever done: make the desert fox afraid of the dark. What did these Australians know about fighting that the entire German war machine had somehow missed? The sun beat down on the sand like a hammer on an anvil. Inside the fortress walls, 14,000 Australian soldiers looked out at the desert and saw dust clouds rising in every direction. Those clouds meant tanks. They meant trucks. They meant the German Afrika Korps was coming, and coming fast. The Australians had arrived in this North African port city just weeks before. Now they were trapped. Erwin Rommel had spent the last 12 days doing something nobody thought possible. He had chased the British army across 500 miles of desert. British tanks burned in the sand behind him. British soldiers surrendered by the thousands. Town after town fell as Rommel pushed forward like a desert storm that never stopped. The British called him the Desert Fox. His own men called him a genius. In 12 days, he had proven everyone right. Now he had his eyes on Tobruk, and everyone knew what would happen next. The fortress would fall. It always did. Trapped armies always surrendered. That was just how war worked. The numbers told a simple story. Rommel had 35,000 troops surrounding Tobruk. Inside, the Australians had 14,000. Rommel had tanks, hundreds of them, plus artillery that could blow holes in concrete walls. The Australians had old guns and not enough ammunition. Rommel had supply lines stretching back to Europe. The Australians were cut off, surrounded on 3 sides by the desert and on the 4th side by the sea. Ships could bring some supplies, but German planes owned the sky. Every supply ship that tried to reach Tobruk was a target. Most never made it. British generals back in Cairo looked at maps and did math. The math said Tobruk would fall in 48 hours, maybe 72 if the Australians were stubborn. The generals started making plans for what to do after Tobruk fell. They would retreat to Egypt. They would give up more ground. They would try to hold the line somewhere else, somewhere farther away. They did not plan for victory. They planned for defeat. That was the smart thing to do. That was what the experts decided. Rommel thought the same thing. He had crushed bigger armies with smaller forces. He had won battles that should have been impossible. Tobruk looked easy. It was just one fortress full of soldiers who had nowhere to run. He told his commanders they would take the city fast. 2 days, maybe 3. Then they would keep pushing east toward Egypt. Nothing would stop them. The war in North Africa would be over by summer. But inside Tobruk, a man named Leslie Morshead was thinking different thoughts. Morshead was not like other generals. He had been a school teacher before the First World War. He had fought in the trenches of France back in 1916 and 1917. He had seen what happened when generals followed the rules and did what everyone expected. He had seen thousands of men die walking toward machine guns in straight lines because that was how armies were supposed to attack. He had learned that sometimes the rules got you killed. Morshead looked at his men and saw something the British generals did not see. These were not normal soldiers. The Australians did not act like British troops. They did not salute as much. They asked questions. They made jokes about officers. They did things their own way. British commanders hated this. They said Australians lacked discipline. They said Australians did not follow orders properly. Morshead saw it differently. He saw men who thought for themselves. He saw men who would not do something stupid just because someone with medals told them to. The fortress of Tobruk sat on the edge of the Mediterranean Sea. Its walls stretched for 30 miles in a half circle around the port. The Italians had built those walls before the war. They had dug trenches and built concrete bunkers. But the walls had gaps. The concrete was cracked in places. The trenches were not deep enough. The whole defense was designed to stop an enemy army from the old war, the First World War, when men attacked slowly and in straight lines. Rommel did not attack slowly. His tanks moved fast. His soldiers rode in trucks and hit hard and fast. The old walls would not stop him. Every military expert knew the truth about sieges. If you were surrounded with no way out, you defended the walls and waited. You sat behind your defenses and tried to hold on until help arrived. You did not attack. You did not go out into enemy territory. That was suicide. The attacking army was always stronger. They had more men and more guns. Your job was to hide behind walls and survive as long as possible. Every military textbook said so. Every general learned this rule. Rommel expected the Australians to follow this rule. He set up his army in a ring around Tobruk and waited for the Australians to stay inside their fortress. Then he would pound them with artillery. His tanks would smash through weak spots in the walls. His soldiers would pour through the gaps. It would be over fast, just like every other siege in history. But on the first night, something strange happened. German soldiers on the outer ring heard noises in the dark. Footsteps, whispers. They fired their guns at shadows. In the morning, 3 German soldiers were missing. 2 were dead. 1 was captured. The Australians had come out of their fortress in the middle of the night and attacked. Nobody did that. Nobody left the safety of walls to attack an army that surrounded them. It made no sense. Morshead had told his men something simple. He said they would not sit and wait to die. He said walls were not enough. The Germans would break through walls eventually. So the Australians would do something different. They would attack. Every night, small groups would sneak out and hit the Germans where they camped, make noise, take prisoners, blow things up, come back before sunrise, keep the Germans awake, keep them scared, keep them wondering when the next attack would come. The British generals heard about this plan and shook their heads. They said it was reckless. They said Morshead would lose all his men in pointless night attacks. They said you cannot win a siege by attacking. Everyone knew that. The experts all agreed. Morshead was making a terrible mistake. But Morshead had seen something in France back in 1917. He had seen that when you did what the enemy expected, you lost. When you surprised them, when you did something they never planned for, sometimes you won. The Germans had a plan for Tobruk. They had a plan for defenders who hid behind walls. They did not have a plan for defenders who attacked back. The Australian plan started small. On the second night of the siege, 30 men crept out of Tobruk through gaps in the wire. They wore dark clothes. They left their helmets behind because helmets reflected moonlight. They moved in groups of 8, sometimes 12. They knew exactly where they were going. During the day, observers inside Tobruk watched the German camps through binoculars. They counted tents. They marked where the Germans kept supplies. They found the latrines and the water tanks and the places where officers slept. Then they made maps. The first patrol moved 2 miles into German territory, 2 whole miles past their own walls, deep into enemy ground. They crawled on their bellies through sand that was still hot from the day. The desert cooled fast at night, but the sand held heat like a stove holds warmth after you turn it off. They could smell the German camps before they saw them. Cigarette smoke, cooking food, unwashed bodies packed close together. At 2 a.m, the Australians struck. They had removed the metal plates from their boot heels so their footsteps made no sound. They carried knives and clubs along with their rifles. Guns made noise, and noise brought more Germans running. Better to be quiet. They crept into a German camp and found soldiers sleeping in tents. Some Australians stood guard. Others cut tent ropes and collapsed the canvas on sleeping men. When Germans stumbled out, confused and half awake, the Australians were waiting. 6 Germans died. 3 more were captured. The Australians vanished back into the darkness before anyone could organize a response. The sun came up and German officers counted their losses. 89 German soldiers were dead or wounded in that first week. 12 were prisoners. The Germans had killed 23 Australians, but that math was wrong somehow. Losing was supposed to hurt the defenders more than the attackers. Surrounded armies were supposed to get weaker every day, but these Australians kept coming back night after night. German soldiers started to have trouble sleeping. You cannot sleep when you think someone might cut your throat in the dark. Sentries fired at shadows. They wasted ammunition shooting at bushes that moved in the wind. They got 3 hours of sleep, maybe 4, then had to be ready to fight during the day. By the end of the first week, German troops looked tired. Their eyes had dark circles underneath. They moved slower. They made mistakes. Rommel noticed. He wrote in his diary every night, and his words showed frustration. He wrote about defenders who did not act like defenders. He used the word unprecedented. That meant he had never seen anything like this before. The Australians were breaking rules Rommel did not even know existed. You were not supposed to attack when you were surrounded. You were not supposed to make the enemy more afraid than you were. On April 13th, Rommel tried something bigger. He threw 5,000 troops at Tobruk's walls in a major attack. He used tanks and artillery. He pounded the Australian positions for hours. The guns were so loud that men inside the fortress could not hear each other shout. Concrete turned to dust. Metal twisted and broke. When the artillery stopped, German soldiers rushed forward expecting to find dead defenders and empty trenches. Instead, they found Australians waiting with machine guns. The Germans ran into a wall of bullets. They fell in waves. Officers shouted orders, but men could not move forward through the fire. By April 14th, Rommel pulled back. He had lost 1,200 men. He had gained exactly 0 ground. Not 1 inch of Tobruk fell into his hands. British generals back in Egypt read the reports and did not believe them. They sent messages asking if the numbers were wrong. Surely the Australians meant to write 120 casualties, not 1,200 German casualties. But the numbers were right. Morshead sent back a simple message saying his men were doing fine and Rommel was not. The problem was that Rommel fought by rules. He had learned those rules in German military academies. He had used those rules to win every battle in France and Poland and North Africa. The rules said you surrounded an enemy and cut off their supplies. Then you attacked with superior force. The trapped army would break. They always did. Except the Australians had not read those rules, or if they had, they did not care. The Australians invented something they called fighting patrols. These were different from normal patrols. Normal patrols went out to watch and gather information. Fighting patrols went out to hurt the enemy. Groups of 8 to 12 men would leave Tobruk between 2 and 4 in the morning. That was when human bodies are most tired. That was when guards fall asleep standing up. That was when reactions are slowest. The Australians did something clever with weapons. They used captured German guns when they could. A German sentry hearing German guns would think German soldiers were doing target practice or cleaning weapons. By the time he realized something was wrong, it was too late. The Australians also learned to move like ghosts. They studied how sound carried across the desert at night. They learned that sand near rocks made different sounds than sand in open areas. They mapped the quietest paths to German positions. Winston Churchill heard about Tobruk and loved it. The British Prime Minister needed good news. Britain was losing everywhere else. German bombs fell on London every night. German submarines sank British ships in the Atlantic. The war looked hopeless. Then reports came from North Africa about Australians who refused to surrender. Churchill gave them a nickname in a public speech. He called them the Rats of Tobruk. He meant it as a compliment. Rats survive. Rats fight. Rats do not give up. The Australians heard the nickname and decided they loved it. They painted rats on their trucks and tanks. They were proud to be rats. But British generals still complained. They sent messages to Morshead saying his tactics were unsustainable. That meant they thought he could not keep attacking forever. Eventually, he would run out of men. Eventually, the Germans would figure out how to stop the night raids. The smart thing to do was conserve strength and wait for rescue. Morshead read these messages and ignored them. His men were not getting weaker. The Germans were. By May, Rommel had committed 5,000 additional troops to Tobruk. That meant 5,000 soldiers who could not attack Egypt. Those soldiers sat outside Tobruk trying to hold a ring around a fortress they could not capture. They were stuck. And every night, the Australians came out and reminded them that they were not safe. The weeks turned into months. And the months piled up like the sand that covered everything in Tobruk. What Rommel thought would take 2 days had stretched beyond all reason. Summer arrived with temperatures that made the desert feel like an oven. Still, the Australians kept fighting. Still, they went out every night. Rommel had never encountered anything like this stubborn resistance. He had beaten larger armies in shorter time. Now 14,000 men were tying down his entire eastern flank. The siege of Tobruk lasted 242 days. That became the longest siege in British Commonwealth history. The record books had to be rewritten because nobody thought defenders could hold out that long when completely surrounded. But the numbers told a story that was even more incredible than the length. The Australians conducted 596 offensive patrols during those 8 months. Not defensive patrols where they watched and waited. Offensive patrols where they went out hunting for Germans. Those patrols killed or wounded more than 3,000 German soldiers. Think about that number. 3,000 enemy casualties inflicted by a surrounded, outnumbered army that was supposed to be defending. The math was backwards. The attackers were losing more men than the defenders. Wars were not supposed to work that way. Rommel kept a diary throughout the war. After everything ended, people read his private words. They found entries that showed how the Australian tactics affected him. In one entry, he wrote about how the Australians fought with fury and showed no fear of danger. He said they were unlike any opponent he had ever faced. This was a general who had fought in France in the First World War. He had commanded tanks in Poland and France in this war. He had beaten the British and French and Polish armies, but the Australians bothered him in a way no other enemy had. Between April and August of 1941, Rommel launched 4 major assaults on Tobruk. Each time he brought thousands of soldiers and dozens of tanks. Each time the Australians turned him back. The casualty rates for those German attacks reached 40 to 60%. That meant almost half the attacking force was killed or wounded. No general could sustain losses like that. Rommel stopped trying direct assaults. He decided to wait and starve the Australians out. But even waiting cost him men because the Australians kept attacking. On the night of May 3rd, a dust storm blew across the desert. The wind picked up sand and threw it in every direction. You could not see 10 feet in front of your face. Most armies would have stayed inside during a storm like that. Moving around in a dust storm was dangerous. You could get lost. You could walk into enemy positions by accident. But the Australians saw opportunity. 60 men left Tobruk during that storm. The wind covered the sound of their footsteps. The dust hid them like a curtain. They found a German artillery position. 6 big guns sat in a row pointing at Tobruk. Crews slept nearby in tents, trying to stay out of the dust. The Australians crept between the guns. They placed explosives on the barrels and the firing mechanisms. They cut ropes. They smashed delicate parts with hammers. Then they melted back into the storm. The explosions came minutes later. 6 artillery pieces destroyed. The crews ran outside to find their guns ruined and no enemy in sight. The Australians were already back inside their own walls, drinking tea. German soldiers started calling them Die Ratten. That was German for the rats. The nickname spread through the Afrika Korps. German troops refused to stand sentry duty at night without doubled guards. They wanted another soldier watching their back because one man alone was not safe. The Australians came out of the dark like animals. They struck and disappeared. German soldiers got more nervous every day. Rommel had faced British troops in France and across North Africa. He had fought Polish soldiers and French soldiers. Those armies were brave and well trained, but they fought predictably. They followed patterns Rommel understood. British commanders especially followed textbook tactics. They positioned forces where military manuals said forces should go. They attacked when and how Rommel expected. The Australians were different. Rommel could not predict what they would do next. That unpredictability kept him awake at night more than any British general ever had. A comparison to another siege shows how different the Australians were. Just 2 months after Tobruk was relieved, in Singapore, 85,000 British and Commonwealth troops faced a Japanese army. The Japanese were outnumbered and low on supplies, but they attacked hard and the British commanders panicked. In February 1942, all 85,000 troops surrendered. It was the largest surrender in British history. Military leaders studied that defeat for years, trying to understand how such a big army gave up to a smaller force. Meanwhile, in Tobruk, 14,000 Australians held out against 35,000 German and Italian troops for 8 months. The comparison was stark. The numbers were similar, but the outcomes were completely opposite. The difference was not in equipment or supplies. The difference was in attitude. In Singapore, defenders waited for the enemy to beat them. In Tobruk, defenders went out and beat the enemy first. The conditions inside Tobruk were brutal. The temperature hit 120 degrees during the day. The sun turned metal too hot to touch. Soldiers had to wait until evening to work on trucks and guns because touching the metal during the day would burn skin. Each man got 1 gallon of water per day. 1 gallon for everything: drinking, washing, cooking. Back home, people used 5 gallons just to take a short shower. The Australians had 1 gallon for an entire day in heat that made you sweat constantly. Food was scarce. Supply ships tried to reach Tobruk, but German planes and submarines hunted them. Some ships got through, many did not. The Australians ate canned food that was months old. They ate the same thing day after day because there was no variety. Fresh vegetables did not exist. Fresh fruit was a memory. Some men got sick from the bad diet. Their teeth became loose, their skin developed sores. But they kept fighting. The dust was everywhere. It got in your eyes and nose and mouth. It covered your food. It filled your lungs. Men developed coughs that would not go away. The dust mixed with sweat and created a paste that caked on skin. There was not enough water to wash properly. Men went weeks without bathing. They smelled like old sweat and dirt and fear. At night, the temperature dropped 40 or 50 degrees. The same dessert that was too hot during the day became cold enough to make men shiver. They wrapped themselves in blankets and tried to sleep while listening for the sound of German artillery. The guns fired at random times to keep everyone awake. A shell might land near you at midnight or 3 in the morning or dawn. You never knew. You just hoped the next one would hit somewhere else. German commanders tried everything to break the siege. They brought in more tanks. They brought in bigger guns. They tried attacking from different angles. Nothing worked. The Australians adapted to every new tactic. When Germans attacked from the east, Australians reinforced the east. When Germans tried night attacks of their own, Australians proved better at night fighting. The defenders learned faster than the attackers. Rommel had to make a terrible choice. He needed those 15,000 troops surrounding Tobruk for his push into Egypt. British forces were building up near the border. If Rommel could break through, he might reach the Suez Canal. That canal connected the Mediterranean Sea to the Red Sea. Controlling it would cut off British supplies from India and the Middle East. It could change the whole war. But Rommel could not advance while 15,000 of his best troops sat outside Tobruk achieving nothing. The Australians had trapped him without even breaking out of their own trap. Military historians later calculated what the siege cost Germany. Those 8 months of delay gave Britain time to bring in reinforcements from other parts of the world. Fresh divisions arrived in Egypt. New tanks came from American factories. Better planes flew in from Britain. By the time Tobruk was finally relieved in December, the British army in Egypt was strong enough to fight back. If Rommel had taken Tobruk in April like he planned, he might have reached the canal in May or June. Instead, he spent the summer going nowhere. All because 14,000 Australians refused to follow the rules about how surrounded armies should behave. December 1941 arrived cold and clear. A British relief force pushed west from Egypt and finally broke through to Tobruk. The siege ended on December 10th after 242 days. The Australians counted their losses. 832 men had died defending the fortress. 2,177 more were wounded. Some wounds were from bullets and shells. Others were from disease and hunger and the brutal conditions. Every casualty hurt, but the numbers could have been so much worse. The German losses were stunning. More than 8,000 German and Italian soldiers were killed or wounded trying to take Tobruk. That was almost 10 times more than the Australians lost. The Germans also lost time and opportunity and momentum. Those things do not show up in casualty lists, but they matter just as much as lives lost. Rommel wrote about Tobruk years later. After the war ended, he put his thoughts into words that others could read. He wrote that the Australian soldier displayed tenacity and fighting spirit that earned his complete respect. Those were remarkable words from a general who rarely praised enemies. Rommel was proud and confident. He did not admit defeat easily, but something about the Australians impressed him deeply enough that he wrote it down for history to remember. The fighting techniques invented at Tobruk became standard practice for armies around the world. Before Tobruk, conventional wisdom said defenders should defend passively. They should hold positions and react to enemy attacks. After Tobruk, military schools taught aggressive defense. They taught that even surrounded forces should patrol aggressively. They should deny the enemy rest and peace. They should attack when possible and defend only when necessary. The Australians proved that the best defense included a strong offense. Night operations became a specialty for elite units. Before Tobruk, most armies avoided fighting in darkness. It was too confusing, too risky. Commanders could not control troops they could not see. But the Australians showed how darkness could be a weapon. They showed how small groups of well-trained soldiers could accomplish more at night than large formations could in daylight. Special Forces units around the world studied the Tobruk patrols and learned lessons that are still taught today. Leslie Morshead went on to greater things. He rose to the rank of Lieutenant General, commanding Australian forces in other campaigns. After the war ended, he returned to civilian life and became the Director of Veteran Affairs. He spent his remaining years helping soldiers adjust to peace. The men who served under him at Tobruk remembered him as the general who refused to give up when everyone said giving up was the smart choice. The Australian Special Air Service was formed years after World War II ended. When they designed their training program, they looked back at history for examples of Australian military excellence. They found Tobruk. The fighting patrol techniques used in 1941 became the foundation for how the SAS trains soldiers today. Men learning to become Special Forces operators study the same tactics that worked against Rommel. They learn to move silently. They learn to strike at night. They learn that aggression and surprise can overcome superior numbers. The story of Tobruk teaches lessons that go beyond military strategy. It shows what happens when people refuse to accept what experts tell them is impossible. The British generals said Tobruk would fall. The German generals said defenders who attacked were fools. Every military textbook said surrounded armies defend passively and wait for rescue. All the experts agreed, and all the experts were wrong. Sometimes being an amateur is an advantage. Morshead had been a school teacher. His soldiers were farmers and factory workers and shop clerks before the war. They had not attended military academies. They had not spent years studying the proper way to fight battles. They just knew they did not want to die sitting behind walls waiting for the enemy to break through. So they did something different. They ignored the rules because they did not know the rules existed. This pattern appears throughout history. Traditional thinking gets replaced when someone tries a completely new approach. Rommel had studied famous sieges from history. He knew what defenders did and how attackers responded. But his knowledge was based on fighting armies that behaved like he expected. When he faced soldiers who invented new rules, all his previous victories could not help him. He kept waiting for the Australians to act like other armies, and they kept doing the unexpected. Morale matters more than equipment. The Germans had better tanks and more artillery and air superiority. The Australians had determination and creativity and a refusal to quit. In a long siege, the side that wants it more usually wins. The Germans wanted to take Tobruk so they could move on to bigger objectives. The Australians wanted to hold Tobruk because surrendering meant prison camps and defeat and shame. The intensity of desire was not equal. The side with more emotional investment fought harder and smarter. Initiative matters more than numbers. 35,000 Germans surrounding 14,000 Australians should have been an easy victory. But the Germans were reactive. They responded to what the Australians did. They built defenses against night raids. They increased sentries. They changed patrol schedules. Everything they did was a response to an Australian action. The smaller force controlled the rhythm of the battle because they acted first and kept acting. The larger force spent all their energy responding. The legacy of Tobruk lives on in military thinking today. Modern armies train for asymmetric warfare. That means fighting enemies who do not have equal strength. The lessons learned at Tobruk apply to those situations. You do not need equal numbers if you have better tactics. You do not need better equipment if you have stronger will. You do not need to follow conventional wisdom if you can invent something better. The siege also changed how the world saw Australian soldiers. Before Tobruk, many people thought of Australians as rough colonials who lacked discipline. After Tobruk, everyone recognized them as elite fighters. That reputation carried forward through the rest of the war and into conflicts that came after. Australian troops were requested for difficult missions because commanders knew they could handle tough situations. But perhaps the most important lesson is about what happens when you refuse to surrender ground. In April 1941, everyone expected Tobruk to fall. The smart move seemed to be retreating to better positions. Why waste men defending a fortress that would fall anyway? Morshead and his Australians had a different view. They believed some ground is worth holding, no matter what experts say. They believed that fighting from a position of disadvantage is better than not fighting at all. That decision to stand and fight changed the entire North African campaign. It delayed Rommel's advance by 8 months. It bought time for British forces to rebuild. It damaged German morale and showed that Rommel could be beaten. All because 14,000 men refused to do what everyone expected them to do. The philosopher in each of us wants to find meaning in history. We want past events to teach us how to live today. The story of Tobruk offers a simple lesson wrapped in complexity. Sometimes the greatest achievement is not conquering new territory. Sometimes greatness comes from refusing to give up the ground you stand on. When experts say your position is hopeless, when conventional wisdom says you should retreat, when every logical analysis says defeat is certain, there is still a choice. You can accept the expert opinion, or you can prove the experts wrong. The Australians at Tobruk chose to fight. They rewrote the rules of defensive warfare and gave the Desert Fox his first defeat. They showed that expertise fights yesterday's war while innovation wins tomorrow's battles. And they taught every soldier who came after them that being surrounded does not mean being beaten. It just means the enemy is within range in every direction.